Some Christians are deeply uncomfortable with the concept of leadership, suggesting that any kind of exercise of power or influence is inappropriate in the church. I remember having a conversation a year or so ago with a fellow archdeacon in another diocese, I won't mention which one it was, who was telling me that they simply don't do top-down in their diocese. All strategic planning, they said, is bottom-up. It comes from the parishes without control or diktat from the bishop or the bishop's staff. Now, I'm afraid I have to admit to having been a little sceptical about this, and so I asked the question whether the bottom-up approach that was being described was an established and recognised strategy of the diocese. She confirmed that to be the case. You can probably predict my next question. So, I asked, who decided that this was to be the strategy? You've guessed it, the bishop's staff. So in my view, the top-down, bottom-up dichotomy that we often hear about is a false one. Good leadership will embrace both, always ensuring that strategic decisions are discerned in the community of faith, rather than steamrollered by one person or a small group of people. But it will also not shy away from the fact that some within that community of faith are called and equipped to exercise leadership, direction in that process of discernment. Such leadership, I believe, is identified by St. Paul in Romans 12 as a gift of God's grace, alongside other ministries, for the building of the church. Paul exhibited this kind of leadership in his own ministry, and as an example of this, I'd like to reflect for a few minutes on the opening 12 verses of Acts chapter 16, the beginning of Paul's second missionary voyage. Let me just read those verses for you. Paul went on also to Derbe and to Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went from town to town, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in numbers daily. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. When they had come opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. We set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city for some days. This is a very significant chapter in the growth of the early church, because it was during this expedition that Paul planted churches in what is now known as European soil, in Thessalonica, Corinth and Ephesus. So what lessons can we glean about missional leadership from the beginning of this journey? I'd like to briefly highlight 5 things. Firstly, Paul's leadership was strategic. In order to appreciate Paul's strategy, we need to glance back to chapter 15, where we read in verse 36, "After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Come, let us return and visit the believers in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord, and see how they're doing.'" The Greek verb translated visit here is episkeptomai, which means look after or care for. It has at its root the word from which we get bishop. Paul was unquestionably a pioneer, an apostolic church planter, but he was also committed to supporting the churches he'd planted as they grow to maturity. This was strategic, proactive ministry. As far as we know, the churches in Cyprus and Galatia had not sent for Paul, but Paul had a clear strategy, a clear reason for wanting to visit them. Like leadership, I'm aware that the word strategy can be a problematic concept for some, but I think it's essential if the church is to be the transformational community that God calls us to be. Making disciples, building the kingdom, proclaiming the gospel are all active and intentional, all strategic. Secondly, in order to pursue his strategy, Paul knew that he must grow his team. Following the disagreement with Barnabas over the inclusion of Mark, Paul set out with Silas to Syria and Cilicia, where Luke tells us they went about strengthening the churches. After this, in verses 1 to 5 of chapter 16, they travelled to the Galatian towns of Derbe and then to Lystra, doing the same. And it was at Lystra that Paul encountered Timothy and wanted to add him to the team, presumably to take Mark's place, just as Silas had taken Barnabas's. In other words, Paul wanted the team to be back at full strength. But more than this, the new team he was building had to be fit for the purpose of reaching and encouraging both Jew and Gentile believers. And Timothy's Jewish-Greek parentage made him an ideal appointment. Again, Paul was being strategic. He knew that good leadership is not a solo pursuit, it's a shared one, and that teamwork is essential. Throughout the letters of the New Testament, we get constant reminders of how God has called the community of the church together as a body and has equipped each person with gifts for the building of the whole. Part of our leadership role is to recognise and draw out the God-given gifts in others so that they can play their full part in God's mission. But in rebuilding his team, Paul demonstrated a third quality of good leadership: an element of pragmatism. Perhaps surprisingly, Paul had Timothy circumcised before he was allowed to set out with them. Coming so soon after the controversial decision of the Jerusalem Council in the previous chapter, in which Paul had played such a vital part, he could be accused of hypocrisy in this regard. But when you scratch a little bit deeper, Paul was being entirely consistent and again strategic in his actions. Luke tells us that Paul had Timothy circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Paul realised that having an uncircumcised Greek as a core member of his team would, in all likelihood, undermine those early missionary endeavours and be a stumbling block for the Jews to accept the gospel. Having already established the theological point that circumcision is not necessary for salvation, Paul felt entirely at ease with the pragmatic decision to have Timothy circumcised for the sake of the gospel. We see this missional pragmatism of Paul again in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where he writes of becoming under the law to win the Jews and outside the law to win the Gentiles, even though he was neither under the law or free from it as a disciple of Jesus. I have become all things to all people, he writes, so that by any means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I might share in its blessings. And fourthly, Luke tells us that this newly formed, pastorally appropriate team went from town to town, communicating the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem, and that as a result, the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in numbers daily. Good leadership results in fruitful growth, both in depth of faith and in the numbers of disciples. You're probably thinking, if only it was that easy. But joking aside, I love the way that Luke reports this, because verse 5 cuts right across the pretty fruitless debate we often hear about whether growth we should be seeking is numeric or about discipleship. The short answer is, it's about both. I'm coming in to land. So far, I've highlighted Paul's strategic, shared, pragmatic and fruitful missional leadership from the opening verses of Acts 16. But my last observation acts as a helpful counterbalance, I think, to all of this, ensuring that we don't merely depend on our own good ideas and strategies for growing the church. Because as well as having a clearly defined plan, at least in his own mind, we also see from verses 6 to 12 of Acts 16 that Paul maintained a flexibility to respond to the Holy Spirit's leading and was able to quickly shift his focus and develop a new strategy when circumstances dictated. Having first visited his young churches, Paul's plan was then to travel into the province of Asia to plant churches there too. But the Holy Spirit had other ideas, and the door to the east closed. Luke doesn't tell us how. All we're told is that the Spirit did not allow them to enter Bithynia or speak the word in Asia. It seems that the guidance was pretty emphatic. And so they ended up at the Aegean port of Troas, having travelled a tortuous route from the southeast to the northwest extremities of Asia Minor. And it was there at Troas that Paul received a vision beckoning them to Macedonia. Notice here Luke's use of we and us in verse 10. We had become convinced that God had called us. It seems that this change of course was not simply at the whim of Paul, informed though it would have been by his powerful vision, but that the whole team had weighed this up together as Paul recounted his experience to them. Indeed, the verb translated as convinced in verse 10, symbaibazo, literally means to bring together. Paul's leadership was a listening leadership, listening to God and to his fellow missioners, and it had to be a flexible leadership, open to change according to their discernment of God's will. Missional leadership then, I offer you, as Paul demonstrates in Acts 16, is strategic, shared, pragmatic and fruitful. But as ministers of the gospel, we should also never lose sight of the fact that it's God's mission we participate in. It's not ours. And as such, we need to remain continually open to the leading of the Holy Spirit, discerning with our team members God's direction, so that we can take hold of every opportunity that he presents to us. Thank you.